At 9:42 in the morning on July 14th, 1944, First Lieutenant Ewald Swanson sat in the pilot's seat of a B-17G Flying Fortress named Mizpah. He watched black clouds of explosions fill the sky over Budapest. He was 24 years old. He had flown 17 combat missions. There was no room for mistakes. The German Air Force had placed more than 288mm anti-aircraft guns around the railway yards below, and they were all shooting. Swanson's B-17 was part of a group of 60 planes from the 483rd Bomb Group, flying out of Sturparone, Italy. The mission was simple on paper. Attack the Shell oil refinery and railway yards in the middle of German-controlled Budapest. Cut off the supply lines feeding the Eastern Front. Get home. But by July of 1944, bomber crews in the 15th Air Force knew the numbers. Out of every 10 men who climbed into a B-17, 8 would not return home. Some would die. Some would be captured. Some would simply disappear. The group of planes pushed forward through the curtain of explosions. Shells burst in black puffs that could tear through aluminum like paper. Mizpah got hit in the tail section, then the wings. Metal pieces punched holes through the body of the plane, but the bomber stayed in formation. Behind Swanson, the crew stayed at their positions. Second Lieutenant Paul Burnt sat in the co-pilot's seat. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley worked the bombardier station in the nose. Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson navigated from the compartment beside him. 8 more men were stationed throughout the aircraft. Radio operators, gunners, the flight engineer. Seconds away from the target, Dudley released the bombs. 2 tons of high explosives dropped toward the railway yards below. The B-17 jumped upward as the weight fell away. Then an 88mm shell hit the nose of the aircraft. The explosion happened instantly. The entire front section of Mizpah disappeared. The nose compartment, the bombardier station, the navigator position, the bomb sight, the glass panels. Everything in front of the cockpit simply stopped existing. Dudley died instantly. Henderson died instantly. The blast wave tore through what was left of the aircraft. The metal structure that had held 2 men and thousands of pounds of equipment was gone. The center of balance shifted backward. With no weight in the nose, Mizpah pitched up into an almost straight-up climb. The bomber began to stall. Swanson could see sky where instruments should have been. Cold air at 30,000 feet screamed through the open hole. The temperature was 40 degrees below zero. Wind tore his flight suit. Blood from the explosion covered the flight deck. Through the gap where the nose had been, Swanson could see the formation continuing toward the meeting point. There was no control stick. The handle that connected to the flight control system had been attached to the forward structure. That structure no longer existed. There were no instruments. The panel had been attached to the nose section. That was gone too. Swanson had no airspeed indicator, no altimeter, no artificial horizon. No way to know what the aircraft was doing except by feel and by looking at the horizon through the massive hole in front of him. But the control cables were still there. The steel cables that ran from the cockpit back through the body of the plane to the rudder, elevators, and ailerons. They were out in the open now, hanging in the wind, but they were still in one piece. Swanson forced the B-17's nose down. He did not know how. There was nothing to push, nothing to pull. But somehow he got the aircraft level. Somehow he got it back into loose formation with the group. The bomber should have been impossible to fly. Boeing engineers had designed the B-17 with built-in stability, but no engineer had planned for this. No manual-covered flying without a cockpit. The only thing keeping Mizpah in the air was physics and desperation. If you want to see how Swanson's crew pulled those bare cables to stay in the air, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Swanson. Behind him, the surviving crew members began moving forward. The radio operator, the flight engineer. They could see the bare cables running through the bomb bay. They could see the wind tearing through the aircraft. They understood what had to happen next. Over 200 anti-aircraft guns were still firing. The formation was still over enemy territory, and another shell was about to hit engine number 2. The second 88mm shell hit engine number 2 at 9:44 in the morning. The right engine exploded in a spray of oil and metal pieces. Flames streamed back along the inboard nacelle on the left wing. The propeller spun for 3 seconds, then stopped. Engine number 2 was dead. Mizpah now had 3 engines instead of 4. The bomber began losing speed. The formation was pulling ahead. Without the cockpit instruments, Swanson had no way to measure how fast they were falling behind. Technical Sergeant Frank Jaminzi, the flight engineer, made his way forward from the top turret position. He could see the problem immediately. The control cables ran through the body of the plane in bundles: elevator cables, rudder cables, aileron cables. They were steel wire rope, each about 3/8 of an inch across. Normally, they were enclosed in pulleys and guides hidden behind panels and structure. Now they were completely out in the open. The wind was pulling at them. Without someone physically holding the cables steady, the aircraft would become impossible to control. Staff Sergeant George Simonelli moved up from the radio compartment. Staff Sergeant Robert Bell came forward from the waist gun position. They positioned themselves near the bomb bay where the main cable runs were visible. There was no discussion, no debate. The situation was clear. Someone had to hold these cables. Someone had to pull them when Swanson needed control input. The problem was coordination. Swanson was sitting in what was left of the cockpit 40 feet forward. The crew was standing in the bomb bay area. The intercom system was damaged. Communication would be nearly impossible. Swanson tried moving the rudder pedals. Nothing happened. The pedals were still attached to the floor, but the cables they normally control were now being hit by 300-mile-per-hour wind. He tried the throttles. Engines 1, 3, and 4 responded. That was something. But without control over the flight's surfaces, the B-17 would eventually spiral out of formation and into a dive. Or worse, it would pitch up again, stall, and spin. Either way, everyone would die. The crew began pulling. They wrapped sections of cable around their hands for grip. The steel was cold. It cut into their gloves. When they pulled left on the rudder cable, Mizpah's nose moved left. When they pulled right, it moved right. The elevators worked the same way. Pull back, the nose came up. Release, it dropped. The problem was that every input had to be perfectly timed. Too much pressure, and the aircraft would overreact. Too little, and nothing would happen. And they were doing this without seeing what Swanson was seeing, without knowing what corrections he needed, without instruments or indicators. Mizpah continued falling behind the formation. The other B-17s were maintaining their cruise speed, heading southwest toward the Adriatic. Swanson's bomber was slower now. The drag from the missing nose section was huge. The destroyed engine meant less power, and the formation was not waiting. They could not wait. Every minute over Hungary meant more exposure to fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The standard procedure was clear. Aircraft that could not maintain formation speed were left behind. By 9:46 in the morning, Mizpah was alone. The formation was a mile ahead, then 2 miles. Swanson could see them in the distance, a cluster of dark shapes against the summer sky. His own aircraft was losing altitude, not quickly but steadily. They had been at 30,000 feet over the target. Now they were at 29,000, then 28,000. The crew kept pulling cables. Their hands were cramping. The cold was brutal. Blood circulation was being cut off by the pressure of the steel against their palms. But they kept pulling. The fuel situation was unknown. The gauges were gone with the instrument panel. Swanson had no idea how much gasoline remained in the wing tanks. He had no idea how long 3 engines could keep them in the air. He had no idea if they were even heading in the right direction. Navigation required instruments. It required a map. It required the navigator who was now dead somewhere over Budapest. All Swanson knew was southwest. Fly southwest. Get out of Hungary. Get over Yugoslavia. Get to the Adriatic. Get to Italy. Get home. Then the crew in the bomb bay started waving frantically toward the rear of the aircraft. Swanson could not turn around to look. The wind pressure through the open nose hole made any movement dangerous. If he unbuckled from the pilot's seat, he could be pulled forward and out of the aircraft. He stayed locked in position, watching the horizon, trying to keep the wings level. But the crew kept waving. Something was wrong in the rear section. Something beyond the missing nose, beyond the dead engine, beyond the bare control cables. Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker, the tail gunner, had been in his position when the nose exploded. The tail section was the most isolated spot on a B-17, a small compartment at the very back of the body of the plane, reachable only by crawling through the waist gun area on hands and knees. Tucker had felt the impact. He had felt the aircraft pitch up violently. He had felt it stabilize, but now he was feeling something else. The tail structure was flexing. The metal framework that held the vertical stabilizer and horizontal stabilizers was moving in ways it should not move. The explosion had created stress cracks somewhere in the body of the plane, or metal pieces had weakened important support members. Either way, the tail section was beginning to fail. If the tail came off, everyone would die instantly. A B-17 without a tail would enter an unrecoverable spin. The aircraft would tumble end over end until it broke apart or hit the ground. There would be no time to bail out, no time to react. The crew in the bomb bay understood this. They could see the tail gunner's position through the body of the plane. They could see the structure moving, and they had no way to fix it. Mizpah was now at 26,000 feet, still descending, still heading southwest. Swanson guessed they had been flying without a cockpit for 4 minutes, maybe 5. Every second felt like an hour. The wind noise was deafening. The cold was going through every layer of his flight suit. His hands on the throttles were going numb, but the throttles were the only controls he had left. Engine power was the only thing he could adjust without help from the crew pulling cables in the bomb bay. Second Lieutenant Paul Burnt, the co-pilot, was still in his seat. His control stick was gone too. His instruments were gone, but he was watching the wings, watching the engines, watching for fighters. German Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s hunted lone bombers. A damaged B-17 separated from its formation was an easy target. No defensive firepower from neighboring aircraft, no mutual support, just one damaged bomber losing altitude over enemy territory. But so far no fighters appeared. The German Air Force was either fighting elsewhere or had not spotted Mizpah yet. The crew kept pulling cables. Their coordination was improving. When Swanson pulled back engine number 1, the aircraft wanted to turn right. The crew fixed this by pulling left rudder cable. When he increased power on engine number 4, they adjusted again. It was not flying. It was group survival through brute force. 10 men working as a single organism to keep 65,000 pounds of aluminum and steel in the air. At 9:50 in the morning, Mizpah crossed the Hungarian border into Yugoslavia. Swanson did not know this. He had no map, no landmarks he could identify through the gaping hole where his cockpit used to be. But the anti-aircraft fire stopped. The black clouds of explosions stopped. That meant they were out of the heaviest defense zones. That meant they might have a chance. A small chance. A chance that depended entirely on how long the tail structure would hold together, how long the crew could keep pulling cables, how long 3 engines could create enough thrust. The fuel gauges were gone, but Swanson could hear the engines. He could feel their vibration through the airframe. They were running smoothly. That meant fuel was still flowing. That meant the wing tanks were not empty yet. But how much remained was impossible to know. B-17s carry 2,800 gallons of aviation gasoline spread across multiple tanks. At cruise power, for engines burned roughly 200 gallons per hour. But they were not at cruise power. They were at maximum continuous power on 3 engines, trying to keep altitude and airspeed. That meant fuel use was higher, much higher. Swanson made a decision. The decision was simple: get the crew out. The aircraft was dying. The tail structure was failing. The fuel supply was unknown. They were still over occupied territory. Every minute in the air increased the risk of total structural failure. If Mizpah broke apart at altitude, no one would survive. But if the crew could bail out while the aircraft was still controllable, most of them would have a chance. They would be captured. They would spend months in prisoner of war camps, but they would be alive. The problem was execution. Bailing out of a B-17 required coordination. The standard procedure involved specific exit points. The bombardier and navigator used the forward escape hatch in the nose, but that hatch no longer existed. The radio operator and others used the waist gun windows or the rear door. The ball turret gunner had to rotate his turret to a specific position before climbing out. Each crew member had practiced this dozens of times in training, but training assumed the aircraft was whole. Training assumed the pilot could communicate over the intercom. Training assumed there was time to organize an orderly evacuation. Swanson had none of those things. He had no intercom. He had no way to give the order. He had no way to coordinate who went first and who went last. And he could not leave his position. The moment he unbuckled, the moment he tried to move toward an exit, the aircraft would become uncontrollable. The crew in the bomb bay would lose any reference for which cables to pull. The B-17 would enter a dive or a spin within seconds. Everyone still aboard would die. At 9:52 in the morning, Mizpah was at 24,000 feet. They had been flying without a cockpit for 10 minutes. Swanson's hands were locked on the throttles. His feet were on the rudder pedals, even though the pedals did nothing without the crew pulling cables 30 feet behind him. Burnt sat still in the co-pilot's seat, watching the horizon, watching the wings, watching for any sign of major failure. Neither man spoke. There was nothing to say. The wind noise made conversation impossible anyway. The crew in the bomb bay made the decision themselves. They could feel the tail structure flexing. They could see the stress cracks spreading through the body of the plane's skin. They understood that staying aboard meant dying when the aircraft came apart. One by one, they began moving toward the waist gun windows. Staff Sergeant Robert Bell went first. He clipped his parachute harness, positioned himself at the window opening, and jumped. The slipstream took him instantly. Staff Sergeant Charles Kelly went next, then Staff Sergeant George Simonelli, then Technical Sergeant Frank Gemenzi. Each time a man jumped, the aircraft became harder to control. Fewer hands on the cables meant less exact inputs. The B-17 began rocking. The wings dipped left, then right. The nose pitched up slightly. Swanson adjusted throttle settings to fix this, but throttle alone was not enough. He needed the rudder. He needed the elevators. He needed the crew pulling cables, but the crew was leaving the ship. They had to. It was the only logical choice. Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker crawled forward from the tail gunner position. He squeezed through the narrow passage, came out in the waist gun area, and saw the empty positions where his crewmates had been standing moments before. He saw the bare control cables now loose without hands holding them. He saw the massive opening where the nose used to be 40 feet forward. He clipped on his parachute and jumped. By 9:54 in the morning, 5 men had evacuated. 5 men were falling under parachute canopies over Yugoslavia. 5 men would be captured by German forces within hours, but 5 men would survive the day. That left 5 men still aboard Mizpah, Swanson in the pilot's seat, Burnt in the co-pilot's seat, and 3 others who had not yet reached the exit points. The aircraft was at 22,000 feet, still descending, still barely controllable, and the tail structure was about to fail completely. The remaining crew members moved toward the exits. Staff Sergeant Paul Hish, waist gunner, went through the window opening. His parachute opened cleanly. Staff Sergeant Robert Tucker, another waist gunner, followed seconds later. That left 3 men aboard, Swanson, Burnt, and 1 more crew member still making his way forward from a rear position. The aircraft was becoming more and more unstable. With almost no one pulling the control cables, Mizpah was responding only to engine power and built-in aerodynamic stability. That stability was designed for normal flight conditions, not for flight without a nose section, not for flight with a failing tail structure. At 9:56 in the morning, the last crew member reached the waist gun area, jumped, and disappeared into the slipstream. Swanson and Burnt were alone. 2 men in what was left of a B-17 Flying Fortress at 20,000 feet over Yugoslavia. The bomber was still descending. 3 engines were still running, but the aircraft was no longer truly flyable. It was barely staying in the air through a combination of leftover stability and the fact that the wings were still creating lift. Without crew members pulling cables, any big control input was impossible. Swanson turned his head slightly and made eye contact with Burnt. No words were exchanged. The wind noise would have drowned out any conversation, but the message was clear. Burnt needed to go. There was no reason for the co-pilot to stay aboard. He had no controls. He had no job. If he stayed, he would die when the aircraft finally broke apart or crashed. The only logical choice was to bail out while altitude remained, while there was still time to open a parachute and survive the landing. Bernd unbuckled his harness. He stood up from the co-pilot's seat. He moved carefully toward the rear of the flight deck, where he could access the main body of the plane and reach the waist gun exit. He looked back at Swanson one final time. The pilot was still locked in position, hands on throttles, eyes forward, holding the dying aircraft as steady as possible. Bernd climbed through the crawlway behind the cockpit and headed back. 30 seconds later, he jumped. Ewald Swanson was alone, one man in a 65,000-pound bomber at 19,000 feet. The aircraft was falling at about 200 feet per minute. Not a dive, just a steady descent. The three remaining engines were producing enough thrust to keep forward speed, but not enough to hold altitude. The missing nose created massive drag. The aerodynamic shape was destroyed. The B-17 was basically a flying brick with wings. The fuel situation remained unknown. The wing tanks could be nearly full or nearly empty. There was no way to tell. The engine's sound gave no clue. Wright Cyclone engines ran smoothly until the fuel supply was completely used up, at which point they simply stopped. No warning, no sputtering, just silence. And if all three engines quit at the same time, Mizpah would drop out of the sky. Swanson guessed his position. They had been flying southwest for about 14 minutes since leaving Budapest. Airspeed was probably around 180 miles per hour, maybe less. That meant they had covered roughly 40 miles, maybe 45. The border between Hungary and Yugoslavia was about 30 miles from Budapest. That meant they were likely over Yugoslavia now, possibly approaching the mountains, possibly approaching the Adriatic coast. But all of this was guessing. Without instruments, without maps, without a navigator, he was flying blind. The question was how long to stay aboard. Every minute at the controls meant the crew below had more time to get away from the crash site. German patrols would search for a down bomber. But if Swanson could keep Mizpah flying for another few minutes, the crew members under parachutes would land miles away from where the aircraft eventually hit the ground. That separation could mean the difference between capture and escape, between imprisonment and freedom. But staying aboard also meant increased risk of dying in the crash. The tail structure was still flexing. The bomber could break apart at any moment. And when Swanson finally decided to bail out, he would have to unbuckle, stand up, move through the aircraft to an exit point, and jump, all while the B-17 was uncontrolled, all while it was possibly entering a death spiral. At 9:58 in the morning, Swanson made his final decision. He would stay with the aircraft for 2 more minutes. That would give the crew more separation distance. That would give him a better chance. Then he would go. Swanson kept his hands on the throttles. The 3 Wright Cyclone engines continued their steady roar. Engine number 1 on the far left wing, engine number 3 inboard on the right wing, engine number 4 on the far right wing. All running smoothly, all using fuel at an unknown rate. The bomber descended through 18,000 feet. At 10 o'clock in the morning exactly, Swanson released the throttles. He unbuckled his harness. The moment the straps came loose, he felt the wind pressure try and pull him forward toward the massive opening where the nose used to be. He pushed back against his seat, then stood up carefully. The aircraft immediately began to pitch. Without anyone controlling the throttles, without anyone making corrections, Mizpah started a gentle left roll. Swanson moved quickly toward the rear of the flight deck. He squeezed through the narrow crawlway that led to the bomb bay area. Behind him, the bomber's nose dropped. The control cables hung loose in the bomb bay. Nobody was pulling them now. Nobody was holding the aircraft steady. Swanson could feel the B-17 speeding up into a dive. He had maybe 30 seconds before the angle became too steep, before the G-forces made movement impossible, before the aircraft entered spin. He reached the waist gun area. The aluminum floor was shaking under his boots. The wind noise was overwhelming. He grabbed his parachute pack from a storage rack, clipped it to his harness, and moved toward the window opening. The bomber was diving now, not straight down, but steeply enough that Swanson had to brace himself against the body of the plane to stay upright. He positioned himself at the waist gun window, looked out at the Yugoslav countryside 17,000 feet below, and jumped. The slipstream hit him like a wall. The wind spun him sideways. The B-17 flashed past, engines still roaring, already 200 feet away and speeding downward. Swanson pulled the ripcord. The parachute opened with a violent jerk that knocked the wind from his lungs. Then silence. Relative silence. The roar of the engines faded as Mizpah continued its dive. Swanson watched the bomber fall. The tail section was still attached, but barely. The entire rear body of the plane was flexing like a reed in the wind. At 15,000 feet, the tail separated. The B-17's forward section pitched, nose down, almost straight. It fell for another 8 seconds, then disappeared into a line of trees 2 miles away. A column of black smoke rose moments later. The fuel tanks had caught fire on impact. Nothing survived that crash. No one could have survived it. If Swanson had stayed aboard for another 30 seconds, he would be dead. The parachute descent was slow. Swanson drifted southwest with the wind. Below him, the Yugoslav landscape showed scattered farms, forests, and small villages. Somewhere down, there were German occupation forces. Somewhere down, there were his crew members who had jumped minutes before him. Somewhere down, there was the reality that his war was over. He was about to become a prisoner. The ground came up faster than expected. Swanson could see trees. He tried to steer the parachute toward an open field, but the canopy was not designed for exact maneuvering. The trees were directly below him now. He hit the upper branches at about 15 miles per hour. Branches snapped. The parachute canopy caught on limbs. Swanson crashed through the leaves and slammed into a thick branch with his left side. He felt his left leg break. The bone snapped cleanly somewhere between the knee and ankle. Pain exploded through his nervous system. He fell another 10 feet and came to a stop, tangled in parachute lines and broken branches 15 feet above the ground. Blood was running down his leg. His flight suit was torn. Deep cuts covered his left thigh, where branches had cut through fabric and skin. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle. He could not move it, could not put weight on it, could not climb down from the tree. He hung there, held by the parachute harness, trying to control the pain, trying to stay conscious. Below him, he heard voices, German voices. German soldiers arrived at the base of the tree within minutes. They were Wehrmacht infantry, part of an occupation unit stationed in the area. They had seen the parachutes coming down. They had heard the crash of the B-17. Now they were collecting American aircrew. Swanson hung still in his harness, 15 feet above the ground, unable to move, unable to escape. One of the soldiers called up to him. Swanson did not respond. The soldiers began discussing how to get him down. They found a ladder from a nearby farm. 2 men climbed up and cut the parachute lines. They lowered Swanson carefully, trying not to make the leg injury worse. When they reached the ground, they laid him on his back in the dirt. A German medic arrived. He examined the broken leg, the cuts, the blood loss. He put on a temporary splint using wooden boards and strips of cloth. He injected morphine from medical kit. The pain began to fade. Swanson felt the drug taking effect, dulling the sharp pain in his leg to a distant throb. The medic wrapped the deep cuts with bandages. He checked for other injuries. Ribs seemed okay. No head injury. No internal bleeding that he could find. The main concern was the leg. Without proper treatment, infection would set in. Without surgery, the bone might not heal correctly. But for now, the medic had done what he could with limited supplies in a forest clearing. The Germans took Swanson to a local command post. From there, he was moved to a Wehrmacht medical facility. A German doctor examined the leg, confirmed the break, and set the bone properly. The procedure was painful despite the morphine. Swanson passed out twice during the process. When he woke up, his leg was in a plaster cast from ankle to hip. The doctor explained through an interpreter that the break was clean. The bone would heal, but Swanson would not walk normally for months. Over the next 3 days, the rest of Mizpah's crew was captured. All 8 men who had bailed out were found within a 20-mile radius of the crash site. None had escaped capture. The Yugoslav countryside was heavily patrolled. Partisan resistance groups operated in the mountains, but the crew had landed in farmland controlled by German forces. One by one, they were brought to the same processing center. Swanson saw them arrive. Burnt, Jimenzi, Simonelli, Bell, Kelly, Tucker, Hish, all alive, all unhurt except for small cuts and bruises. All now prisoners of war. They were taken to a prisoner of war camp in Austria, Stalag Luft 4, a place specifically for captured Allied aircrew. The camp held about 10,000 American and British pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and flight engineers. Conditions were harsh, but not brutal. Food was limited. Red Cross parcels arrived irregularly. The barracks were cold in winter. Medical care was minimal, but the Germans generally followed Geneva Convention rules for officer prisoners. There were no mass killings, no organized torture, just confinement, boredom, and waiting. Swanson's leg healed slowly. He spent the first 2 months on crutches. The cast came off in September of 1944. Physical therapy was basic. He walked around the camp perimeter every day, rebuilding strength in the damaged leg. By October, he could walk without help. By November, the limp was barely noticeable. By December, he was physically recovered, but the war continued. The camp remained locked. Guards patrolled the fence. Escape attempts were rare and mostly unsuccessful. The crew of Mizpah settled into the routine of captivity. They talked about the mission, about the 88mm shell, about the 10 minutes they flew without a cockpit, about pulling the control cables by hand, about watching their bomber fall into Yugoslav forest, about Dudley and Henderson, who died instantly when the nose exploded, about how close they all came to dying that day. And they waited for the war to end, waited for freedom, waited to go home. Winter turned to spring. The Germans began emptying camps as Soviet forces advanced from the east. Prisoners were marched westward in long columns. Conditions got worse. Food became scarce. Some men died during the forced marches. Others escaped in the confusion. Swanson and his crew stayed together. They marched through Germany as the Third Reich collapsed around them. And on April 30th, 1945, American forces reached their column. They were free. 9 months of captivity ended on a dirt road in central Germany. American tanks rolled past. Soldiers gave out food, water, and cigarettes. Medical people checked for injuries and disease. The former prisoners were taken to collection points, then to airfields, then back to Italy, and eventually to the United States. The crew of Mizpah went home, all 8 survivors, all 8 men who had pulled control cables by hand at 30,000 feet over Budapest, all 8 men who had jumped from a dying bomber and lived. Ewald Swanson returned to civilian life in Michigan. He married, raised a family, worked quietly for decades. He rarely spoke about July 14, 1944. When asked, he would say only that he had been lucky, that the crew had been lucky, that Dudley and Henderson had not been lucky. He did not consider himself a hero. He considered himself a pilot who had done his job under impossible circumstances. The Army Air Forces disagreed. Swanson was promoted over the following years, eventually retiring as lieutenant colonel. The recognition was not for a single mission, but for a career of service. But that single mission remained the defining moment. The 10 minutes without a cockpit, the 10 minutes that should have killed everyone aboard. The crew stayed in contact. They attended 483rd Bomb Group reunions. They gathered every few years to remember the war, the missions, the men who did not return. The bond between them was unbreakable. They had survived something that should not have been survivable. They had flown a bomber with no nose, no instruments, no cockpit, and bare control cables exposed to 300-mile-per-hour wind. They had done it through coordination, through determination, through the simple refusal to give up. And they had honored Dudley and Henderson by surviving, by making sure their sacrifice meant something. Paul Berndt, the co-pilot, stayed in Michigan near Swanson. They remained friends until the end. Frank Jimenzi returned to his family and rarely discussed the war. George Simonelli kept photographs from mission. He showed them to his grandchildren decades later, explaining what it meant to pull steel cables while a bomber fell apart around you. The others scattered across the country, but they remembered. They all remembered. Ewald Swanson died in 2009 at the age of 89. He had lived a full life. He had seen the world change. He had seen aircraft change from propeller-driven bombers to jets to spacecraft. But the aircraft he remembered most clearly was Mizpah, the B-17G that lost its nose over Budapest, the bomber that flew on borrowed time and crew determination, the aircraft that proved human could overcome engineering limits. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about bomber crews who refused to quit when physics said they should. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Ewald Swanson and the crew of Mizpah don't disappear into silence. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley died instantly when that 88mm shell hit. Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson died beside him. They were 23 and 24 years old. They never came home. But the 8 men who survived carried their memory forward for 9 months in a prisoner of war camp, for decades afterward in Michigan and across America. And now, through this story, their names live on. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.